silence is the first thing you have to understand. It's not just an absence of noise, a simple pause between sounds. No, this is something heavier. It's a presence, a physical weight that presses in on your eardrums, that smothers the memory of sound beneath a thick, suffocating blanket. It's been 3 days since I last heard the human voice. A bird's song from the linden tree in the churchyard. Even the distant rumble of a car on the cobblestones outside. 3 days since God cleared his throat and the world went quiet. My name is Markus, and for 40 years I was a priest. I'm 62 now, and my hands, the ones that blessed the sick and offered up the body of Christ, have a tremor I can't seem to control. They shake as I polish the silver chalice, my reflection wavering in its gleaming surface. A tired old man with hollow eyes and a collar that feels more like a noose with each passing hour. I still do the work. I have to. Habit is a fortress in a world without ramparts. I sweep the nave, the rhythmic whisk of the broom, a ghost of a sound only I can feel. I replace the candles, their tiny flames waging a silent, lonely war against the gloom. I wind the old clock in the sacristy, though the passage of time feels like a cruel joke. The church, my beautiful St. Lambert's, has stood in this small town for 600 years. Its spire has pierced the sky through plagues and wars and the slow, grinding erosion of faith in the modern age. I always thought its greatest enemy was apathy. I was a fool. My goal, my purpose for my entire adult life was to be a shepherd, to guide my flock, to keep their eyes turned toward the promise of salvation. I preached of the rapture, not with the fire and damnation of my predecessors, but with a quiet, certain joy. I described it as a reunion, a glorious, loving call from the Father to his children. I told them not to fear it, but to welcome it, to live a life worthy of that divine invitation. I knew them all. I knew the sturdy faith of Herr Schmidt, the warden, who polished the church bells until they shone like mirrors. I knew the gentle piety of Frau Becker, who arranged the altar flowers every Saturday without fail. I knew the gap-toothed, irrepressible smile of little Anna, who would always try to sneak a piece of communion bread for the birds. I loved them. They were my life's work. And then the invitation came, and my name wasn't on the list. It happened during morning mass. The church was full, or as full as it ever was these days. The light from the great stained glass windows, St. Michael casting down the dragon, St. Francis preaching to the birds, painted jewels on the ancient stone floor. I had just raised the host, my voice filling the reverent hush with the sacred words of consecration. Hoc est enim corpus meum. This is my body. And in that moment of profound holiness, it happened. Not a flash of light, not a trumpet blast from the heavens, just an exhale, a gentle collective sigh that seemed to pass through the very stones of the church. I blinked, my eyes adjusting from the host to the congregation, and the pews were empty. Every man, woman, and child gone. Herr Schmidt's keys lay on the floor by the heavy oak door. Frau Becker's spectacles rested on her open hymnal. The page turned to "A mighty fortress is our God." Little Anna's small, worn catechism book was left on the kneeler, a crayon drawing of a smiling Jesus tucked inside. They were just gone.
My first trauma, I suppose, was a quiet one, a priest's long sorrow. For years, I watched the pews grow a little emptier each Sunday. I saw the faith of my youth become a relic, a quaint story people told their children but no longer truly believed. I fought against it with sermons and prayers, with a faith so loud I hoped it would be contagious. I thought that was the great trial of my life. How laughably, unforgivably arrogant I was. This is my real trial. This is my judgment. To be left behind in the silent, empty house of a God who has taken everyone else home. I am alone in a world scrubbed clean of humanity. For days, I walked the empty streets of my town, a ghost in a museum. I peered into vacant houses, their doors left unlocked. At the Schmidt home, a half-drunk cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, a phantom of steam still rising in my imagination. In the Becker's garden, laundry still hung on the line, stiff and dry, snapping in a wind I could not hear. Every detail was a fresh torment, a testament to a life interrupted mid-breath. I called out their names until my throat was raw, but the only answer was the echo of my own unworthy voice, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive, waiting silence. My life's devotion was not just a failure. It feels like a cosmic punchline. And so my new purpose, my final, terrifying pilgrimage began. I am no longer a shepherd. I am an inquisitor, haunting the ruins of my own faith. And I have one question, a question I scream into the crushing, holy silence every single day from the top of the bell tower. Why? I am searching for an answer from a God who has made it perfectly, terrifyingly clear that he is no longer listening. For 10 days, the silence was my only companion. I had developed a routine born of madness and habit. Morning prayer in the empty church, a long, pointless walk through the town, then back to the rectory to eat canned soup and read scripture by candlelight, searching for a verse, a prophecy, anything that could explain my damnation. Job, Jeremiah, Lamentations, the words of abandoned prophets were my only company. It was on the 11th day, as I was cutting through the old market square, that I heard it. A sound so alien, so impossible, it stopped my heart. The clatter of a tin can falling on cobblestone. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the wind. It was sharp, definite, and undeniably human. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening, my breath catching in my throat. Hope is a more terrifying thing than despair. Despair is a warm, heavy blanket. Hope is a shard of glass in your gut. For a full minute, I didn't move, didn't breathe, convinced it was a trick of my unraveling mind. I strained my ears, praying to hear it again, praying I wouldn't. And then a whisper. A woman's voice, indistinct, but it was a voice. My own name died on my lips. I crept forward, using the canvas-covered market stalls for cover, my heart a frantic, painful drum against my ribs. Peeking around a fruit stand laden with apples that were beginning to soften and rot, I saw them. A young man and woman huddled together with an older shopkeeper. 3 of them. They were alive. They were here. They hadn't been taken. My legs gave out, and I sank to my knees behind the stall. a sob of purest, agonizing relief tearing itself from my chest. That night was the first time I felt peace since the world had ended. We sat around a small fire built in a metal drum, our faces flickering in the warm light, our quiet words a defiant miracle against the vast, silent dark. Their names were Philip, Rachel, and Catherine. They had been in the deep cellar of Catherine's bakery when it happened, taking inventory. They thought it was a bomb, a new kind of silent, neurological weapon. I didn't have the heart to tell them my theory of the rapture. Why burden them with damnation when they had just escaped death? For a few hours, I was a priest again. I listened to their fears, offered what little comfort I could. We shared a bottle of wine Catherine had salvaged, its taste on my tongue a sacrament of fellowship. For the first time in 11 days, I slept without nightmares. Curled in a sleeping bag they gave me, warmed by the fire and the simple, profound grace of human company. I felt a flicker of my old purpose returning. Perhaps this was my test, not to be left behind, but to shepherd this tiny, final flock through the end of the world. I woke to the gray light of dawn, a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. The fire was a heap of gray ash. The bottle lay on its side, empty. Rachel's woolen scarf lay on the ground where she had been sitting. But they were gone. I blinked, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. "Philip?" I called out, my voice a dry, panicked rasp. "Catherine?" The silence that answered was deeper, heavier, more mocking than before. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore, it was an absence of them. Their shoes were still lined up neatly by their sleeping bags. A half-eaten apple, showing the brown of the air, sat on a crate. It was the church all over again. The keys on the floor, the spectacles on the hymnal. A scene left in the middle of a breath. God hadn't just taken my congregation, He had waited until I found a new one, until I felt the warmth of hope, and then He had taken them too. It was a calculated, deliberate cruelty. Denial is a powerful instinct. They left, I told myself. They got scared in the night, and they ran. It was a lie, and I knew it. But it was a lie I clung to with the desperation of a drowning man. I spent the entire day investigating their departure. I was no detective, just a priest trying to reason with a miracle. A terrible, inverted miracle. I looked for footprints leading away from the square, but the cobblestones were clean, undisturbed. I walked the edge of town, scanning the empty roads for any sign of them. Nothing. I checked the bus station, the train depot. Everything was as it was left, silent and still. There was no evidence of a departure because there had been no departure. There was only removal. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, I found myself back at the market square, at the site of our dead fire. The point of no return isn't a line you cross, it's a realization that settles in your bones. They hadn't left. They had been taken. And I was the reason. I was the common denominator. My presence was a curse, a spiritual contagion that marked those near me for extraction. I sank to my knees, the fight draining out of me, leaving only a hollow ache. It was then, as I stared at the empty space where Rachel had sat laughing just hours before, that I saw it. It's hard to describe. It wasn't a creature, not a monster of shadow and fang. It was a flaw in the world. The air where she had been sitting seemed to shimmer, to warp like heat haze on a summer road, but there was no heat. The edges of the fruit stall behind that spot were blurry, indistinct, as if reality itself was thinner there. It was a hole in the shape of a person, a wound in the very fabric of existence. I stared, my mind screaming as the realization crashed down upon me. This wasn't a punishment from a distant, silent God. This was something active. I wasn't just left behind in an empty world. I was trapped inside a prison, and the bars were made of absence itself.
My days of wandering were over. I retreated to my church, the great, silent St. Lambert's. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was my cell. The shimmering absences began to appear everywhere, my curse made visible. I saw them in the pews, human-shaped voids where the faithful once knelt. I saw one in the confession booth, a distortion in the air that felt like a listening, judging non-entity. I saw a small one, child-sized, by the baptismal font where I had blessed little Anna. Each one was a fresh torment, a ghost made of nothing. My prayers became arguments, then accusations, then finally just ragged, whispered curses. Sanity is not a fortress. It is a thin pane of glass, and mine was covered in a web of fractures. The final crack came on a Sunday, the day of the Lord, a bitter irony that tasted like ash in my mouth. I had found Anna's catechism book. The sight of her clumsy, earnest drawing of Jesus holding a lamb, so innocent and so gone, broke the last thread holding me together. I decided that if God would not answer my prayers, perhaps he would answer my blasphemy. That evening, I walked to the main altar, not as a priest, but as a prosecutor. The cathedral was cavernous, the dying light of the sun bleeding through the stained glass, painting the stone in colors of blood and twilight. My hands did not shake anymore. They were steadier with a terrifying, absolute purpose. I took the communion wafers, the sacred body of Christ, from the tabernacle. I remembered placing them on the tongues of my flock, their faces full of reverence. I crumbled them onto the floor, grinding the papery dust into the stone with my heel. I took the sacramental wine, the holy blood, and poured it not into the chalice, but onto the pristine white altar cloth, watching the dark red stains spread like a mortal wound. I grabbed the heavy, gilded Bible from its stand, the same one from which I had read the promise of everlasting life, and threw it down the stone steps of the chancel. Its spine cracked with a sound like a bone breaking, its tissue-thin pages fluttering out like crippled birds. Then I turned to the crucifix, the life-sized, centuries-old carving of the suffering Christ that hung over the altar. I stared into its serene, wooden face, and I felt nothing but a cold, burning rage. This was the author of the silence, the architect of my damnation. "Do you see me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in the unholy vastness. It was no longer a question, it was a challenge. "Do you see your good and faithful servant now? Was this not enough? Was my life not enough for you?" I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar. I remembered placing them on the tongues of my flock, their faces full of reverence. I crumbled them onto the floor, grinding the papery dust into the stone with my heel. I took the sacramental wine, the holy blood, and poured it not into the chalice, but onto the pristine white altar cloth, watching the dark red stain spread like a mortal wound. I grabbed the heavy, gilded Bible from its stand, the same one from which I had read the promise of everlasting life, and threw it down the stone steps of the chancel. Its spine cracked with a sound like a bone breaking, its tissue-thin pages fluttering out like crippled birds. Then I turned to the crucifix, the life-sized, centuries-old carving of the suffering Christ that hung over the altar. I stared into its serene wooden face, and I felt nothing but a cold, burning rage. This was the author of the silence, the architect of my damnation. "Do you see me?" I screamed, my voice echoing in the unholy vastness. It was no longer a question, it was a challenge. "Do you see your good and faithful servant now? Was this not enough? Was my life not enough for you?" I grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar. "I gave you everything, my life, my faith, my flock, and you left me. You left me in this tomb to be haunted by nothing." I swung the candlestick, the metal connecting with the carved wooden legs of the crucifix with a sickening crack. A splintered chunk of wood flew past my head. "Answer me," I roared, striking again and again, chips of painted wood flying with every blow. My throat was raw, my arms ached. Tears and sweat streamed down my face, mingling with the sacrilege. I was a wild animal, destroying the very thing I had built my life to protect. I was trying to escape the prison of absence by committing an act so present, so violent, that it could not be ignored. I raised the candlestick for one final desperate blow, aiming for the serene face. My scream was formless, a pure distillation of grief and fury. And as the echo of that final, soul-shattering scream died away, a new sound entered the silence. It was the squeal of a heavy, unoiled hinge.
I froze, the candlestick slipping from my numb fingers and clattering on the stone floor. Slowly, my chest heaving, I turned. The massive oak doors at the far end of the nave, doors that took 2 men to move, were swinging open. A figure was silhouetted against a light that was not the soft gray of twilight, but a harsh, sterile white. It wasn't an angel, it wasn't a demon, it was a man, dressed in simple white trousers and a tunic, an orderly. He took a hesitant step inside. "Father Markus," he said, his voice gentle, achingly real. "It's all right, just take a deep breath. We heard you shouting." As he walked toward me, the world began to unravel. The towering, vaulted ceiling of the cathedral, with its intricate Gothic arches, seemed to recede, flattening and lowering, melting into a plain, white-painted ceiling with a water stain in the corner. The towering stone pillars on either side of the nave thinned and shrank, becoming the simple, dark wood backs of pews in a much smaller room. The magnificent stained glass windows, my jewels of light, faded into tall, narrow windows of reinforced glass, crisscrossed with wire and barred from the outside. The grand main altar where I stood, the site of my blasphemy, dissolved into a simple wooden table covered with a plain cloth. The great carved crucifix I had been mutilating was gone.
In its place, hanging on the wall, was a small plastic cross. This was not my cathedral. This was the chapel of a psychiatric hospital. The man, his name was Thomas, reached me. He didn't look at the mess I had made, the crushed wafers, the spilled grape juice, the broken Bible from the side table. He only looked at me, his eyes full of a sad, weary pity. "It was the furnace, Father," he said softly, as if continuing a conversation we had had 1,000 times. "You have to remember, it was a year ago. The gas leak during the winter service. It was silent. No one woke up." The words were keys, unlocking a room in my mind I had sealed with stone and prayer. A memory, sharp and unbearable, pierced through the fog. The biting cold of that January morning, the smell of incense and something else, something sweet and wrong. The feeling of drowsiness I had mistaken for spiritual peace. The weight of bodies in the pews, not vanished, but slumped, still. Herr Schmidt by the door, Frau Becker in the front row, little Anna on her mother's lap. All of them, my entire flock, asleep. I was found hours later by the side door, half frozen, barely breathing, the only one, the shepherd who was the sole survivor of his slaughtered flock. The trauma of being left behind was never about God's judgment. It was about the random, senseless cruelty of a faulty pipe. My mind, the mind of a man who saw God's hand in everything, couldn't accept the sheer, meaningless horror of it. It couldn't bear the grief, the guilt. So it did what it had been trained to do for 40 years. It built a cathedral around the pain. It created a grand theological narrative, the Rapture, to explain the unexplainable. It was easier to believe I had been deemed unworthy by the creator of the universe than to accept that I was simply the one who had been sleeping closest to the drafty door. The people in the market square, other patients I had seen in the garden. My mind couldn't allow them to stay. My delusion required absolute solitude to survive, erasing anyone who threatened to tether me to the unbearable truth. The shimmering absences weren't wounds in reality. They were the scars in my own psyche, marking the empty spaces where my loved ones used to be. I was left behind, not by God, but by my own congregation in a silent, mundane tragedy. I was left to grief, and in my madness, I built myself a lonelier, more terrible prison than any God could have devised. Thomas gently put a hand on my shoulder. "Come on, Markus," he said, not using my title. "Let's go back to your room." I let him lead me away from the altar, out of the chapel that had been my cathedral. My footsteps didn't echo. There were soft, muffled sounds on a linoleum floor. The crushing, holy silence I had screamed into was replaced by the quiet, antiseptic hum of the hospital. A distant television, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes, a muffled cough from another room. The story was over. God hadn't left me. My mind had. And as the door to my small, safe room clicked shut behind me, I was left, finally and truly, with the one thing I had been running from all along: the devastating, absolute silence of their absence.
There are more scares to share. Press the like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single terrifying moment. You're helping me investigate the deepest, darkest corners to bring you stories that haunt your dreams.